Hello and welcome. Good afternoon. We are doing a special daytime stream of the Katie Halper Show. And we have back with us Norman Finkelstein, political scientist, enemy of very bad people, including Alan Dershowitz, and the author of 11 books, and the author of a forthcoming book on cancel culture, and very prolific, again, scholar, writer, activist, and we are glad to have him back on. And we would like to talk to you, Norman, about Gaza. And can you just tell people kind of the basics of what Gaza is, how it came to be what it is today, and what we're seeing today?
I'll try to be as succinct as possible. Gaza and the West Bank are the two areas that did not come under Israeli control after the 1947-49 war. The rest of Palestine became the State of Israel, the two exceptions, the West Bank and Gaza, the West Bank including East Jerusalem. The basic facts to know about Gaza as you contemplate what's unfolding now, the basic facts are these. Number one, Gaza is overwhelmingly a child population. The total population is about 2.1 million people. Of those 2.1 million, a little more than half are children under the age of 18. Number two, 70% of Gaza comprises refugees or descendants of refugees, who are under international law also classified as refugees, the descendants. So we're talking about an overwhelmingly refugee population and a majority children population. Gaza has undergone many devastating assaults by Israel, but we'll leave the murderous assaults aside for the moment and just look at the picture as it stands now in terms of what you might call the socioeconomic dimension of Gaza. So, Gaza under international law remains an occupied territory. Israel withdrew its settlements from Gaza in 2005. However, it didn't withdraw its troops. It redeployed them along the perimeter of Gaza. And nobody can go in, nobody can go out, no merchandise can go in or go out. The territorial waters, the airspace, the population registry, the electricity, the internet, everything is controlled by Israel. That being the case, Gaza, as I said, is technically under international law, still occupied by Israel. In terms of the realities in Gaza right now, I'm going to simply use the the shorthand expressions. The Human Rights Watch, in its most recent report, stated that Israel is committing crimes against humanity in Gaza. Now, when we say crimes against humanity, we have to be able to concretize that. What does it mean? So let's try to give it some flesh. In 2006, there was Palestinian parliamentary elections, January 2006. Among the observers was former US President Jimmy Carter. He declared the elections that were held across the occupied territories, not just Gaza, the West Bank, and including, my memory is, yes, East Jerusalem. And he declared the elections fair and free. Unfortunately for Israel and the United States, Hamas, the militant Palestinian organization, it won the elections. Immediately after it won the elections, the Israelis, followed by the US, followed by the EU, decided to punish the people of Gaza for electing the wrong government. And so that's when the current blockade of Gaza began. That blockade was then tightened in 2007 when the US, Israel, and some Palestinian factions acted in cahoots to try to overthrow the government in Gaza, and that coup attempt was preempted by the current government. Now, since then, there has been that blockade of Gaza, which, as I said, constitutes a crime against humanity, according to Human Rights Watch. A crime against humanity is what it sounds like. That is, it's a very high-ranking, if we can use that term, it's a very high-ranking crime under international law. What does it mean again concretely? It means, as Human Rights Watch and many others have said, it means Gaza is the largest open-air prison in the world. The people are trapped in Gaza. Let me add another dimension to that prison. Gaza is among the most densely populated places on God's earth. And the population is confined within an area of land. I was just thinking about it today. It's 25 by 7 miles. What does that mean? The length of Gaza is a little bit less than a marathon. That's literally the truth. The length of Gaza is a little bit less than a marathon. A marathon is 26.2 miles. Gaza is about 25 miles. Its width, I'll use an example because I tend to be sedentary, so my examples are very parochial. I live in Coney Island. From Coney Island to Grand Army Plaza in Brooklyn, from Coney Island to Grand Army Plaza Library, it's about 7 miles. So Gaza, the whole of Gaza, is less than a marathon in length and roughly the distance from Coney Island to Prospect Park or Grand Army Plaza, 7th Avenue, in Brooklyn. That's Gaza. That is Gaza. Now, I want to just add 2 more points to that. First of all, I should give you, as some of the socioeconomic statistics. Half the population, as I said, is children. 96% of the water in Gaza is unfit for human consumption. 80% of the people of Gaza live on international humanitarian aid. 50% of the population of Gaza is unemployed. About 70 to 75% of the young people are unemployed. That's Gaza. Gaza is, somebody described it as a toxic waste dump. Now, I want to just add one other element to the picture. In 2000, I think it's 2002, 2003, a very respected Hebrew University professor, he's no longer among the living, Baruch Kimmerling. He wrote about the then Prime Minister Ariel Sharon, it was 2003, and then he gets to the question of Gaza. Now, I want you listeners, your viewers, to keep in mind what I'm about to say. I described the travails of Gaza after 2006, when Israel imposed that brutal, immoral, illegal blockade. This book was written before 2006. The author, among the most respected of Israeli sociologists, he had a chair at the Hebrew University. And he writes in the book that the Strip, meaning the Gaza Strip, has become the largest concentration camp ever to exist. It's not only the fact that he's Jewish, he's Israeli, and he invokes the analogy of the largest concentration camp the world has ever seen. He's describing a situation which was a pale comparison to what Gaza has become. A pale comparison. This was 2003. Now, the only element I have left out is beyond the steady situation in Gaza, there is the periodic massacres which Israel visits on Gaza. In 2008 to 9, it was Operation Cast Lead. 2012, Operation Pillar of Defense. 2014, Operation Protective Edge. These massive, heartless, almost science fiction-ish destructions of Gaza by the regional Goliath against a wholly defenseless civilian population, overwhelmingly children. And I would want to add, and that's where we're going to leave off, at least as a background, many people say, well, why don't the Palestinians find a Gandhi? Why don't they engage in nonviolent resistance? That used to be a kind of talking point of so-called liberal Jews in the US. Well, let's see what happened. In 2018, March 2018, the Palestinians in Gaza, attempting to break the siege of Gaza, engaged in massive, nonviolent, overwhelmingly nonviolent civil resistance. How did Israel react to that overwhelmingly nonviolent civil resistance? There was a very thorough, surprisingly thorough, I would say, UN report on the subject. It said that In the course of the Great March of Return, you might recall, because it's not yet ancient history, there were the Israeli snipers assembled along the periphery of Gaza. Who did the snipers kill? Well, according to the UN report, they targeted children, they targeted journalists, they targeted medics, they targeted disabled people. They targeted people 300 meters away from the periphery. They targeted, if you read the descriptions, and the descriptions are very vivid and detailed, they targeted people who were standing by a tree, just standing there. They targeted photographers who were just standing there, journalists and also civilian photographers. That is the reality of the state of Israel. It's very hard for, say, my generation to assimilate that reality because our view, I mean, my generation and before my generation, 1 and 2 generations before, our conception of a Jew was, if you were to say the kind of prototype, it would be an Albert Einstein kind of unworldly, the hair flying out. It used to be said of Einstein that at Princeton, he was the Institute for Advanced Studies. He would walk around barefoot, and when he was told, "You're barefoot," he said, "Oh, I forgot to put on my shoes." That was the otherworldly type that was a Jew.
I should grab my dad. He's in the other room. I'm not kidding.
It was Franz Kafka, the big ears, the physically a little bit feeble. And for American Jews, the type, the prototype, and I'm not being facetious here, I do think it's accurate. I know this is a serious occasion, and I'll do my darndest to maintain the moral sobriety that it requires. It's Woody Allen, the horn-rimmed glasses.
Ashkenazic.
Well, you get the type, the type.
Yeah.
And then it was just very hard to convince Jews of my generation that a Jew could do this sort of stuff. Line up along a perimeter with Gaza, this world's largest concentration camp, this world's largest open air prison. You have a population of about a little over 1 million children who have been confined, trapped in this area. The length of a marathon, the width of half of Brooklyn, the width, not the population, the width of half of Brooklyn. And they're not going to let them out. And if they try non-violently, peacefully to free themselves, you're going to get mowed down. Mowed down. That's the reality of Israel. And I think it's a lot of, for your generation and the generation after, it's not so hard to digest, because you kind of see Israel for what it is. But my generation, the preceding ones, we didn't see Israel for what it is. We saw Israel for what Jews were. And a Jew just didn't do those things. But when you read the human rights reports, the accounts by journalists, it really has become, I would have to say, it's become a unhinged place. If you were to ask what it most resembles, I would say it resembles South Africa during the apartheid years, resembles the American South during the Jim Crow years, from the end of Reconstruction till the 1960s. That's what Israel is. And when I say that's what Israel is, I'm referring to the whole of the population. I don't accept the distinctions between the religious and the secular, uh, between the right and the left. No. As a broad but accurate generalization, the Israel as it's become is very much like the American South from the end of Reconstruction till the Civil Rights Movement. Okay, so I think that's a broad overview, and now we can proceed with your viewers and listeners' questions.
Great. So I am continuing to collect some, but I also have some that I've come across, and I collected some from Twitter. So one of them is you kind of addressed, which is, well, they already gave the land back to the Palestinians in Gaza, but you addressed someone already. Another really popular one is, what are Israelis supposed to do because of the rockets?
Well, let's start with the cause, and then we'll get to the effect. The question is whether the rockets are the cause or are they the effect? And I'm going to do everything in my power to be absolutely respectful of the questions and to assume that the questions are being asked in good faith. So I would ask the person, what would you do if you were trapped in this sliver of land, which respectable human rights organizations call an open air prison, which respectable scholars describe as a concentration camp? What would you do? And in particular, what would you do if you had a large number of children? Gaza families tend to be on the larger side. If you had a large number of children and they were trapped like you, and you knew each day when you gave them water that you were poisoning them, the water is unfit for human consumption. And what would you do if this didn't go on for 1 month, 1 year, 5 years, 10 years, but the worst condition? Everything is relative, because Baruch Kimmerling was talking about 2003 and he described it as a concentration camp. Let's start from when the blockade, the intensity of the blockade was escalated in 2006 and then 2007. So we're talking about about 15 years. What would you do? Would you lay down and die? Would you passively accept your fate? What would you do? The Palestinians don't have, in Gaza, don't have an infinite number of options if they want to retain their dignity. I assume, and actually in recent years, there have been minor, pretty minimal offers by Israel to Palestinians. We'll open the door if you promise never to come back. To a few Palestinians, that offer has been made. But if you are determined to stay in your home, what options really do you have? When Hamas was elected in 2006 in that fair and free election, Hamas had made many statements. I can't go through them all with you now, but they are documented. They made many statements indicating that they were willing to accept a settlement of the Israel-Palestine conflict on the June 1967 border, what's called the two-state settlement. They did enter a concern about the settlement of the refugee question, and it's a real question, it's a complicated question, but they were perfectly reasonable in the terms that they were willing to negotiate on. Israel rejected all of them. Israel will only accept one thing from Palestinians. You have to, I'll give you an analogy. During the era of the Sandinistas in Nicaragua, Ronald Reagan was the president. And he said at the time, we're waiting for the Sandinistas to cry uncle.
Mm-hmm.
We're going to turn the screws, turn the screws, turn the screws until they cry uncle. And it's similar with the Palestinians in Gaza. Israel demands their surrender. Israel demands that they accept a fate that is less equal than that of Jews. Now, to your listener, to your viewer, to your questioner, you may think that what I'm saying is an exaggeration. You might say it's being emotive, rhetorical, and so forth. It's not my opinion. See, this is the thing. If you read the human rights organization B'Tselem, which is
the Israeli, just so everyone knows, the Israeli human rights organization, B'Tselem.
Yes. And its leader, Hagai ElAd, he has an op-ed in today's Washington Post. And he says in the Washington Post, in understated prose, but nonetheless in accurate prose, not trying to massage the truth, he says, and I'll quote not from his op-ed, but from the position paper that B'Tselem issued. A regime of Jewish supremacy from the Jordan River to the Mediterranean Sea. This is apartheid. And then he goes on to say, describing the whole of Israel, not just the Gaza, the West Bank, East Jerusalem, the whole area from the river to the sea. He says it is organized under a single principle. There's one principle that underlies that whole area, advancing and cementing the supremacy of one group, Jews, over another, Palestinians. That is what they want the Palestinians to accept. Not just in Gaza, everywhere from the river to the sea. They want Palestinians to accept a Jewish supremacist state. Human Rights Watch uses a different locution. It doesn't say a Jewish supremacist state. It says it's a state based on Jewish domination. Now, I ask your questioner, is any people obliged, are they obliged to accept a system where the dominant group insists across the board in distribution of tax money, in distribution of land, in access to towns, in access to building permits? In East Jerusalem, that's the big issue, the building permits. They won't give an Arab a building permit. Why? It's very simple. I would like your listener to hear it, because they want a Jewish majority in Jerusalem. They want a Jewish majority in Israel. They want a Jewish majority everywhere. And then I have to ask your questioner, are they obliged to accept that fate? Would you ever, assuming your questioner is an American, would you ever expect of an African American that he or she had to accept their fate, that they would be second-class citizens in the United States, that they would legally not have the right to a building permit because they're black, legally not have equal schools, quality schools, because the budgets are distributed to prefer Jews, or in our case, it would be whites? Would you accept that fate? And then in Gaza, it's 10 more layers. It's not just Jewish supremacy. It's not just Jewish domination. It's being confined to an open-air prison, a concentration camp, not being allowed to leave, not being allowed to come back. Now, I want to make one more point. I am not trying to be manipulative emotionally, though I think it's legitimate to be passionate about things. I'm trying to be factual. I would like people to understand what it means to be a person in Gaza. Gaza is 70% refugees. That means they already lost their homes. They already lost their homes. Then, once they were expelled to what became Gaza from the state, what became the state of Israel, then they were locked in the prison. They were locked in the prison. You don't want to hear the word concentration camp or the phrase concentration camp? Okay, I'll spare you. Although Baruch Kimmerling did not spare his readers, I'll spare you. They didn't want to be locked in the prison. They didn't want to be locked in the prison in among the most densely populated places in the world. So they went from expulsion to confinement. And then every few years, including as we speak right now, in the prison, their home is destroyed again. Expelled, imprisoned, and then Israel targets their home again. I've written quite extensively on this subject. These civilian homes that are destroyed during Operation Protective Edge in 2014, it was 51 days. During Operation Protective Edge during July, August 2014, Israel destroyed 18,000 homes. Now, you might say fog of war. We like to use the word collateral damage to phrase it. That's not what happened. We have extensive testimony from Israeli soldiers. There was an organization then, I think it's since been inactive as far as I could tell. There was an organization called Breaking the Silence. Mm-hmm. And it was Israeli soldiers who described after Operation Protective Edge, what did they do? And if you read the descriptions, They would come into neighborhoods, rope off the neighborhoods. There's no fighting going on. There's no fog of war. They would
Right.
rope off the neighborhoods, bring in D9 bulldozers, and just flatten the neighborhoods. I mean, the level of heartlessness, the level of callousness, the level of sheer moral debasement that the Israelis have undergone, it's kind of breathtaking. There's no there's no human feeling. I remember I lived in the West Bank during the first Intifada. I lived with two families, uh, one in outside Fawar camp, which is a refugee camp, and one in Beit Sahur. And the family I lived with outside Fawar camp, it was a family name. The family name was Hesh Hesh, Hash. And the father, Musa Abu Hesh Hesh, he was a kind of a remarkable human being. At least I would say as remarkable human being as I've ever met in my life. And um, he eventually ended up working for B'Tselem. He's been there now for like the last 15 years. If you Google his name, I'm sure pictures will come up. He's quite well known among the people. And he once said to me, he was a communist and he has a kind of very cosmopolitan worldview. That's why when I went over with a delegation, and he insisted he wanted a Jew in his home. That was the kind of person he was and is. And I'll never forget, Israel at that time used to blow up homes of anybody who was accused of throwing rocks. That was their punishment, blow up the home. It's one thing to just talk about. It's another thing to see it. You go into a home, you tell the people to get out, you rope off the area, and you just blow it up. You blow up the house. And I remember he looked at me with, it was a kind of moral perplexity. How could people do that? For a Palestinian, the most precious thing they have, because they don't have investments, aside from the very rich class. I'm talking about ordinary Palestinian. There are no investments. There are no 401ks or things like that. All of their investment is their home.
Mm.
And to just routinely blow it up as if, I don't know, it's as if you're a kid in a block corner and someone next to you with a little maliciousness knock down their blocks. That's the kind of moral callousness. Callousness doesn't really catch it. It's really more moral debasement. So they lose their country. They're then confined in the prison. And then periodically, as we're speaking now for the fourth time, there was Operation Cast Lead, then Pillar of Defense, then Protective Edge. And it had been silent for about 7 years. And now it's Operation Guardian of the Wall, some ridiculous title. And now they're destroying the homes again. You know, um, I don't think that anybody who has any knowledge of the topic would ask questions like, why are they firing rockets? The obvious question is, why aren't they firing more?
I agree. Yeah, of course. Yeah. But I think people, when they ask that question, they mean, what is Israel supposed to do? So,
well, I think
yeah.
the answer to that question is very straightforward. The answer is Israel should stop committing crimes against humanity and then see how the population conducts itself. If you enable people to live by current human standards, a reasonable, decent life, the most likely outcome is going to be they'll react like most people in the world. But if you're going to confine them in a prison and you're going to deny them any of the basic, forget about amenities, any of the basic necessities of life, turn a people which, like all peoples, have pride and turn them into beggars, where 80% are dependent on humanitarian handouts, they're not able to work, then why would you be surprised if they refuse to accept those terms of existence? And I would add that it requires, I think, just like it did in our own country, it requires a large amount of, let's just call, reinventing themselves by Israelis. The modern world is not accepting states based on Jewish supremacy or any supremacy. They're not accepting of states in which one people is entitled by law to dominate another people. And they're not accepting the idea, which is unfortunately built into the Jewish state idea. They're not accepting the idea that you can marginalize and then evict people who get in the way of your demographic juggernaut. What's happening in East Jerusalem, if your viewers would use a little bit of imagination, it's not like the Israeli state. They like to call it's just a real estate dispute.
Yeah, right.
It's not a real estate dispute. It's one flashpoint of a process that began 70 or so years ago. It's one more step or stage in this relentless juggernaut, this maw which consumes more and more, and in the process, it confines the people, it suffocates the people. It turned the West Bank into 122 isolated islets among this Jewish population. They try to confine them and confine them and confine them as they expand more and more with one purpose, to build that Jewish majority. Is that legitimate? Is that legitimate? You can perhaps debate it, but I don't think the modern world is any longer accepting of that. And in fact, as I said in a previous program with you, the modern world was accepting of it for a very long time. The basic attitude was how Israel carries on internally is its own business. The problem was how they were carrying on in what were called the occupied Palestinian territories. But now the consensus is shifting. They're not accepting that even Israel inside its borders, what it's doing is legitimate. You don't have the right to turn a whole population into second-class citizens whose only purpose is to eventually disappear. That's the ideal outcome, that they just disappear. So personally, I when you ask what should Israel do, I think ideally what it should do is pretty simple. Obey the law. Obey the law. You don't have the right to confine 2 million people in a prison. You don't have the right to fire on fishermen who go out just to try to make five by going fishing. You don't have the right. You don't have the right to deny young people who win scholarships to UK universities, to European universities. It's their dream come true. They worked hard, they studied hard, they applied, they got accepted. And then Israel says, you can't leave. You can read the Human Rights Watch report. They have a section on Gaza where they describe case studies. And they describe what goes on there. I mean, these are, sorry if you don't want to hear it, and sorry if I get canceled. I wouldn't want you to get canceled.
Okay.
But this is a state built on sadism, humiliation, and degradation. It is. You see these young people, they win the scholarship. They then come to the border, and the guards take them into a room, and they make a requirement. We'll let you leave if you spy for us, if you act as a snitch for us. Tell us, give us this piece of information, give us that piece of information. Now, I'll tell you, Katie, I'm not sure what I would do. I'll tell you the honest to God truth.
Yeah, me too.
If I thought to myself, this is my chance to get out of this concentration camp, and the quid pro quo is I have to be a snitch. Who's working for Hamas? You know, which neighbor of yours?
Mm-hmm.
I don't know. I'm not a saint. I'm not sure what I would do. And I have the advantage that when I do something that's deserving of martyrdom, it's publicized. So I a martyr with honor. A martyr with honor. So I stuck to my principles. I did my best. I was denied tenure eventually. And I still had the satisfaction that people knew what happened to me. There was recognition of my martyrdom, so to speak. There was recognition. There was a moral validation of what had been done to me, which I'll be honest with you, it makes it feel much less terrible.
Yeah, of course, yeah.
Here is a kid from Gaza who, if they refuse to snitch, they refuse to be a rat, they're just tossed right back into the prison and forgotten. And it's not just students. They do the same thing with people who need life-saving operations. They do the same thing. You want that operation for your cancer? You got to be a snitch. You got to tell us, give us information on your brother, on your uncle, on your cousin. That's what they do. That's a daily practice of these sadists. Now, I'm going to say something else, which people won't like to hear. But I'm going to say it because it's factually true. A lot of people say, well, you have to make the distinction between the state and the people and things like that. That's not true in Israel. And I wish, Katie, you listen to me, and I hope you'll accept I'm not saying it in malice, but I'm not going to lie. Israel prides itself
Right.
on having a citizen army.
Right.
That means everybody is involved in this process. Every single Israeli, except for that small handful of religious Jews who get exemption, every single Israeli is a war criminal of some kind. Every single one. The Israelis at the checkpoints who humiliate you. Have you ever gone to Israel? Have you ever gone there?
Yeah, once, yeah.
All the guards at the airport, all the guards who humiliate and degrade every single Arab who passes through that airport. Every single one of them is a participant in this process. It is not the army versus the people, the state versus the people. No. Every single Israeli passes through the army. It is a citizen army and is implicated in one way or another in this process of systematically degrading, humiliating, torturing in the case of Gaza, torturing the Palestinian people. That's not a happy thing to say, but it's a fact. You should just see. Now, I admit I've not been there since 2004. I was denied entry permanently for all intents and purposes. I was denied entry. But the way these guards carry on at the airport, the way they carry on at the checkpoints, humiliating the grandfathers in front of their grandchildren, humiliating and degrading every Arab who passes through the airport, the whole place. That's why, there are two characteristics of Israelis now. Number one, there's no left, there's no center in Israel. There's just a right, a far right, and ultra right. They're all way off the spectrum, that country. And secondly, they used to do these surveys. Which country do you find the tourists from the most obnoxious? Israelis always won. You know why they always won? It's not something necessarily intrinsic to them, their DNA.
Because they all travel after the army or before?
No, well,
before the army or whatever?
It's after.
After, yeah.
But the reason they're such obnoxious tourists is because they all treat foreign countries like it's the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza. They carry on that way.
Really? I'm surprised. Wouldn't they treat like white Europeans not?
No.
It's just them and everyone else. Is that how they see it? Generalizingly, obviously.
They used to say there was the governor of New York way before your time.
Koch.
No, that was the mayor of New York. The governor of New York State. His name was Nelson Rockefeller.
Oh yeah, that one. Yeah.
And they used to say about Nelson Rockefeller, he's a true Democrat. He's a true Democrat. He has contempt for everybody. And
that's true, yeah.
And that's the Israelis. They don't care if you're a white European. They don't care if you're an Arab. You're just a goy.
Well, something. Yeah, sorry. Keep going.
No. So, the level of moral debasement, if you read the reports of like breaking the silence, one of their commanders is killed. They describe these scenes. This is just a typical scene. They describe the scene. One of their commanders is killed. They said the new commander, he says to the troops, choose a house. Choose a house. And then one of the soldiers says, I don't like that house, that orange house. I don't like the color. The commander says, blow it up. No, I'm not making it up.
Mm.
I'm not making it up. That's the attitude. Blow up the house. It's the degree to which Palestinians have been dehumanized. It's breathtaking. If you read during the Great March of Return, you'll have a kid sitting in a wheelchair. He's 300 meters away, nowhere near the border. They kill him. They kill him. These are the snipers. You can't claim, oh, they're not trained or there's a kid out of control. This is their elite troops. They're elite troops. They just shoot and murder the kids. And that's what's happening now. If you read the reports now, the intensity of the bombing and shelling, because Israel has its usual dilemma. The dilemma is it happens every single time the same way. The so-called rockets, I prefer to call them projectiles. The projectiles come from Gaza. Then Israel sends in its air force to level the place. Now, let's be clear. Now it's more restricted because of the international attention. They have a problem there. They have the problem of the television cameras, and they have the problem of the looming prosecution in the International Criminal Court. So there are some limits on what they can do. There are limits. Anyone who tells you, oh, Israel can do whatever it wants, they don't know politics. No, they can't do whatever they want. President Biden is telling them, you're being watched. There are limits that what you can do. No large-scale massacre. You can't do that now. There's a limit. There's a problem there for them, especially with the ICC impending prosecution. So they go in with the Air Force, and then every single time they have the same problem. You cannot take out these rockets with an Air Force. They're too portable. They come out of a hole, they go back in the hole. The only way you can eliminate them is by sending in a ground invasion. And the ground invasion is a problem. You know why?
Because Israelis have to do it.
Because most Israelis are like you and me. They don't want to die in a war. They like nightclubs. They like traveling. They have careers. Do you want to die in some mud heap in Gaza? They have no desire to die. And when you go into Gaza, it's a little bit scary. At the beginning, they go in, they bomb everything in sight, everything to the left, everything to the right. They flatten it. Still not enough. Hamas, they still come up. They still come up. And then they have, in the last attack in 2014, Hamas was surprisingly effective. It killed 66 soldiers, which for Israel is a lot. Yeah. It killed 66 soldiers. And they know this time it's not going to be easier because the level of hatred and loathing for those murderers, and then with the images of what they did in Al-Aqsa Mosque, the Israelis, the attacks on the worshipers. So they know the pent up, built up wrath and hatred that these people are willing to give their lives to teach these invaders a lesson. So now they're stuck. Netanyahu knows you go into Gaza, it's unclear how you get out. And in addition, it's unclear when you're going to get out. The how and the when, which obviously are interrelated. And so now they're stuck. Netanyahu knows that ground invasion, not a smart idea. So they keep saying, there's going to be a ground invasion, there's going to be a ground invasion. When we last communicated, it seemed as if they announced the ground invasion had begun, but then they retracted it. So they now have a real problem, which I'd like to explain to your listeners. The problem is this: they cannot indiscriminately level Gaza now.
You have a student saying hi, by the way. Brad, can you highlight that again? Julian Schwartz, lucky to have been taught and mentored by Professor Finkelstein at DePaul. Anyway, thought you wanted to see that.
They can't go in and level Gaza because too many cameras, too much attention. ICC is watching. They're issuing statements lately. ICC issued a statement yesterday on the situation in Gaza. And also, Biden doesn't want it. Biden has bigger fish to fry. He has the domestic agenda. He wants the agreement with Iran. He doesn't want the Israeli albatross. So he's clearly signaled you're going to have to keep it within limits, what you're doing. So what do? They can't launch the ground invasion. They can't indiscriminately level Gaza. So what do you think they do? They choose certain spots and they keep bombing it and bombing it and bombing it and bombing it. And the artillery, keep launching the artillery shows, So for the people who are within those areas, it's like the apocalypse. I mean, when you listen to the reports now, a friend of mine was saying he was talking to his sister-in-law, and his sister-in-law said, I lived through 2 intifadas. I lived through 3 Israeli invasions. She said, there was nothing ever like this. This is like the whole ground is shaking constantly because they're limited in exactly what they can do now. If they had their choice, of course, they would go into population centers and just wipe them out. But their options are very limited right now. So they're just trying, as I said, if you read the Israeli press, they're saying, we've run out of targets. We've run out of targets. And if they start expanding the range of targets, they're going to have a problem with the international community. And they're also having a problem with the Israeli cities, marches today in Jordan, marches today in Lebanon, all of them on the border with Israel. And in one case, I think it was Jordan, they attempted to cross the border. There is a problem. They're stupid. They're stupid. They not only say this, they're stupid because the Arab world was so divided.
Right.
And,
now this is
large number of states were already working hand in glove with Israel. Egypt, Saudi, Emirates, Bahrain, and then they attack Al-Aqsa Mosque during Ramadan. I mean, you have to be nuts. You're gonna attack the 3rd most holy site of Islam,
which has been left out of the. I think people are starting the coverage, and a lot of people predicted this, that they were just going to start the news coverage as with the rockets, as opposed to what happened right before, which is a pattern. So we don't see the context. The media does not provide the context. So it seems like out of the blue, the Jew-hating Hamas, who are always rearing their pesky heads. This is obviously me talking as the Western media, not as Katie Halper. This is why we can't have nice things type of narrative.
Well, there is the immediate impetus, which
Right.
was
And then there's, yes.
the attacks, uh, the Israeli police attacks on the demonstrators in the neighborhood of Sheikh Jarrah. Then there was the attacks on the mosque, and doesn't really surprise that Hamas, which is a very religious organization, and when it sees the evictions in Sheikh Jarrah, it's reminiscent of the life, the fate of 70% of Gazans. I'm sure there was political calculation. I have no doubt about that. They're a political organization. Political organizations make political calculations. But to my thinking, that's irrelevant
Right.
when you're trying to evaluate the justice. Were they obliged? Remember, East Jerusalem, under international law, it's the capital of what is supposed to become the state of Palestine. It's their capital for Gazans. It's also fused with its political significance, its, so to speak, secular significance. It's the capital of their state. It's also obviously invested with a huge amount of religious significance. So, if you see the capital of your state, Israel, is carrying out evictions of the population, then you see assaults on one of the most sacred of the religious sites of your religion. It would be very surprising if they didn't react. You don't have to get into the mindset of their political calculation. On its surface, it would have been most surprising if they had just not reacted, especially as the people in the neighborhood were reacting. These are their people. It's not something distant. Gaza is as close to East Jerusalem. My memory is, I could be wrong, but my memory is because when I went, you could freely, when I used to live there, you could freely enter Gaza. You just took a car. It's 2 hours. It's 2 hours from Jerusalem to Gaza. It's not like a foreign country. It's just a 2 hour car drive. So it's their people, their state, their religious symbols, their capital. Why would you be surprised if an organization, a representative organization, were to react? Why would that surprise you? And that leaves aside the broader dimension. Do people locked in an open air prison have the right to use whatever force is available to them to break free? No, Kate, I'm going to offend people for a third time. I said that it's a nation of war criminals. I believe that. I said there is a real sadistic element there, similar, if you know the history of the American South, to the way whites derived a certain amount of sadistic glee from humiliating and degrading Black people. And when Black people got out of line, they lynched them. And the lynchings were public events, picnics, factories and schools were let out early. They would lynch the person. They would then set the body afire. And then they would remove the body parts the heart, the liver, and they would auction off the body parts. And then they would photograph the person who purchased the body part. They would photograph the person holding the body part, and that was then used as a postcard. That was our American
I never
South.
knew that.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. Well, you should read the literature on the lynchings. Yeah. That was our.
Yeah, I didn't know the body part stuff.
Oh,
yeah.
yeah. They auctioned them off, and then they were photographed as postcards. That was, as I said, there was an element of sadism, a grisly sadism among Americans, and it's the same thing with the Israelis. So I said, I have offended twice, not intentionally, but trying to be honest. So before we came on the air, you said, well, maybe you should say something about yourself and your family. And I cannot claim that even though I devoted my whole of my adult life to books and to studying, my life is on a bookshelf. That's my life. When I uh, moved to this current apartment, I changed floors. I didn't change the building. I decided.
Great Jewish diaspora.
I said, the only reason I have all these books is to show off to everybody how much I read. I had thousands of books. I said, you know what? I'm going to give the books away to the Grand Army Plaza Library. I know the head person. He was a student of mine, Nick Higgins. I said, you know what? I'm going to give them away. And it was a hard thing for me to do, to give them away, because I felt like each book was 3 days of my life. So for each book, I'm giving away a part of my life, So I tend to be a cerebral person. However, there's obviously an emotional component to who I am. Now, both of my parents passed through the Nazi Holocaust. I know everybody claims, oh, my father was a Holocaust survivor, my grandfather, you're full of it. There were a few survivors. That's what made the Nazi Holocaust the Nazi Holocaust. It was so efficient. If everybody who claimed to be a survivor is a survivor, my mother used to say, then who did Hitler kill? Everyone claims they were a survivor. There were a few survivors. My mother and my father were two of them. They were both from Warsaw. They were in the Warsaw Ghetto until the uprising was suppressed in 1943. There were about 20 to 30,000 survivors of the uprising, and they were then deported to Majdanek concentration camp. So both of my parents were deported to Majdanek, and then my mother ended up in 2 slave labor camps, and my father, I don't know the details because I was never able to discuss it with him. But my mother told me he was in 8 concentration camps, and he ended up in Auschwitz, and then he was in the Auschwitz Death March. So I freely admit I look at these events through the lens of my parents' suffering. And I also look at through the lens of what they would say, because politics is about facts, but it's also equally, it's about moral judgment. There are the facts, and then how you weigh the facts on a moral scale. And I use the moral judgment that, in my opinion, what would my parents say in this situation? So they're trapped in the Warsaw Ghetto. Let's take before the deportations began. deportations begin to the death camps, probably 43, 44, I think. But the ghetto is 1940, 41. What would my parents say? You're trapped in this concentration camp. I once asked my mother, I said to her, when you heard during the war that the German cities were being bombed, I said, what was your reaction? You know, it's bombing civilians, bombing German cities. And she said to me, what did we feel? We felt, I'm going to call her now, if we're going to die, we're going to take some of them with us. That was the feeling. If we're going to die, then we're going to take some of them with us. That's how people are, you know? So you're a mother or a father of maybe 4, 5, or 6 kids, and you're watching them just rotting in this prison. Am I going to deny them any means at their disposal to free themselves from this prison, which Human Rights Watch calls a crime against humanity? That's what it says. Now, bear in mind, and I hope your listeners will bear in mind, this is multiple crimes against humanity piled on each other. The eviction of these Palestinians from their home in 1947 to 49, crime against humanity. The entrapment of them in this sliver of land, refusing to allow them to leave or to return to the sliver of land. Crime against humanity. The systematic military assaults, the massacres every few years. Crime against humanity. It's this compounding of crimes against humanity that these people have to endure. And I am going to deny them the right to fire what are in effect overwhelmingly. I have to still study closely what's happened now, because it might be different. I have to check. But in the past, these weren't rockets. They were bottle rockets. Actually, that's what experts call them, bottle rockets. They were the kind of thing you fire in the 4th of July from a bottle, if you know what I mean, the firecracker and the thing. If you looked at Operation Protective Edge in 2014, I already mentioned to you 18,000 Palestinian homes were destroyed. And the Israelis justified it by saying the rockets, the rockets, the rockets. Do you know how many houses the Palestinian rockets destroyed? I'm quoting to you the Israeli Ministry of Foreign Affairs. One. 18,000 to 1. So I'm going to deny them the right to fire those rockets, which really are essentially an SOS to the world. You know, SOS, help me. SOS, help us. No, I'm not going to deny them that right. And I personally don't believe international law denies them that right. I would be very happy, and I've communicated it, I would be very happy to represent the Palestinian leadership in Gaza in the ICC. I think the law is on their side, but I'm not going to go through the technicalities now. As to what's happening now, it's possible, if you were to ask my opinion, but I can't prove it. I'm simply speculating, having looked through all the available information now. If you were to ask me what's happening now, I would say probably in the last 7 years, they developed a few rockets, which have a potentially lethal impact. You could say maybe, who knows, maybe 100, maybe 50, I don't really know. And so some of the rockets have actually inflicted some damage. They say there are about, I guess, 9 Israelis killed now, 7 or 9 Israelis killed now. I can't remember the exact number. And a few places have been significantly damaged. So I would say, if you bear in mind Gaza is hermetically sealed, if you bear in mind they have excellent intelligence in Gaza, you would imagine that notwithstanding those two factors, hermetically sealed, excellent intelligence in Gaza, you would imagine that they were able secretively, maybe they had one bomb factory and maybe they made, as I say, a dozen, 2 dozen, a score, 2 score, I don't know. I'm pulling numbers out of the air. Some rockets. But this whole barrage, the barrage it's all bottle rockets. If it were real, okay, ask yourself a simple question. If it were real, these hundreds of rockets, would only 9 people be killed?
Right.
That's not very believable.
Yeah.
They're talking about an unprecedented
The Iron Dome.
Hundreds and hundreds and hundreds. Well, there's got to be more than 9 people killed if it's hundreds and hundreds of rockets each hour, they're saying, or each day. It's got to be more than 9 people killed. It's mostly just, in my opinion, I admit it's speculative. And I'll tell you the truth, Kate, I don't really care. I don't. If they were real rockets, I would still say, you don't like the rockets? End the siege. Stop the crimes against humanity. And I'd like to speak to your audience. I mentioned my parents' experience, but I'd like to speak to something which I remember. I began college in 1971, September. You know what was September 1971? It was the Attica uprising, the Attica prison uprising in upstate New York. And the uprising began with the prisoners taking hostages. They took hostages of the prison guards, the warden. They took hostages, okay? No one was listening to them. The conditions there were inhuman. I don't remember anyone with a conscience who berated or scolded the prisoners for taking hostages so the world would finally listen to how they were being brutalized, animalized in Attica prison. So I'm now going to accept a different standard for the people of Gaza. They're doing 1,000th part of what happened in Attica. They can't take Israelis. I mean, they captured a few soldiers, Shalit and a couple of others, but they can't even take hostages. So they fire mostly bottle rockets, and even with their real rockets. You don't like the rockets? Then end the siege of Gaza. As Hagai ElAd wrote today in the Washington Post, he said, for Israelis, Gaza doesn't exist. That's what he wrote. It's the first sentence. If you can bring it up now, Washington.
Yeah, I can.
Yeah, the first sentence. Read it.
I tweeted it because it's paywalled. So 1 second, let me just get in. I tweeted some screenshots of it.
Even on paywall, they usually give the first sentences.
No. I'm screenshot the whole thing so I could. Oh yeah, that's true. Right. Hold on 1 second, please. Let me just turn the volume. Okay, so let's see. Israel has chosen a two. Can you guys see this? Is this visible? This is from the Washington Post. Israel has chosen a two-tiered society. Violence is the inevitable result. The first sentence you said?
I think it was the first.
Most Jewish Israelis spend their time pretending that Gaza and its 2 million Palestinians have fallen off the face of the earth. The besieged civilian population, the polluted water.
Okay, go ahead.
The polluted water, the denial of.
I wonder if you can read it again a little more slowly, because not everybody can read it.
Okay. Most Jewish Israelis. Okay, let me also try to make it bigger. 1 second. Let's see if this works. No, I don't know why it doesn't. Okay. Most Jewish Israelis spend their time pretending that Gaza and its 2 million Palestinians have fallen off the face of the earth. The besieged civilian population, the polluted water, the denial of exit permits, even for essential medical care, the endless ways in which Palestinians in the Gaza Strip are humiliated by Israel day in and day out, all are largely invisible to the Jewish half of the population living between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean Sea. Okay. Invisible until...
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
Invisible until once every few years the sirens and the rockets serve as a terrible awakening.
Exactly. If you don't have the rockets, nobody gives a damn about them. So what are they supposed to do? Just lay down and die? We didn't hold that standard with the people in Attica. Our hearts went out. We understood. Nobody was listening to them until they took those hostages. Nobody cared about them. So they fire the rockets. So somebody remembers there are people there, 1 million children. They have that right. They have that right morally. And in my opinion, they have that right legally. But I'm not going to get into the legal technicalities. That's for another time in another place. They have that right. So don't scold the people of Gaza. Don't scold the people of Gaza because they want to live. The Israelis want to go on their vacations. They want to hang out at their beaches. They want to go to their discos. They want to go clubbing. Too bad. You're not going clubbing. You're not going clubbing. You're going to have to deal with these people. You're not going to get me to condemn it. I am happy that they're fighting back. They give dignity to what it means to be a human being. They give dignity to what it means to be a human being. We Jews are supposed to take pride in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising because unlike all the other Jews, we're told, all the other Jews were like sheep to slaughter. But the Jews in the Warsaw Ghetto Uprising, we're supposed to be proud of them. That they gave us dignity, that they resisted the Nazi oppressors, murderers. But the Gazans, they're supposed to go like sheep to slaughter. They're just supposed to languish in that prison, languish in that concentration camp, and the Israelis are supposed to carry on like they don't exist. They're supposed to be allowed to carry on like they don't exist. No. Sorry. If the Jews have the right to resist, they have the right to resist. So, what's my answer to the rockets? Stop torturing them. Stop torturing them. It sickens me. And my highest regard to Hagai ElAd. Then just those 3 sentences, he sums up the reality. That these people are being tortured and tormented. Nobody gives a darn to them. They're just invisible. And then they do what needs to be done. So he's a good egg, as they say. I told you when we last talked. I don't know him personally. He's a Harvard-educated physicist, and he took on the tough job. The tough job is telling the truth about Israel from inside Israel. That for Israelis, he's the ultimate traitor.
Right.
The ultimate traitor. I told you there was a almost comic scene in the UN between Hagai ElAd and the Israeli ambassador, and then the Israeli ambassador is smiling in English and saying, "Isn't it wonderful how we speak freely to each other?" And then he turns to Hagai ElAd in Hebrew, which nobody else at the Security Council understands. And he says, "You dirty traitor." Yeah, he's got courage. I don't know what I would do. You see, I don't have so much physical courage. I have to admit, I don't know what I would do in situations like that. To write an op-ed like that.
I hope he has good security detail.
Right? Premises state.
Yeah. I hope he has bodyguards. I assume he does.
I assume he doesn't. He doesn't strike me as the type.
Well, the reason that I think it's, I mean, we do have to have about 17,000 more discussions to talk about things, including the legal question. But also, I just find it, and there's this whole debate about how much to center Jewish voices or not. But just pausing that for a second, I think that, people, including in this chat, will say, "You don't know, it's complicated, you don't live there, I'm in a bomb shelter." And to me, it's like, well, there are lots of ways we can discuss this, but there are Israeli Jews, who think it's not okay, that the treatment of Palestinians is not okay. So that the whole argument that makes it almost like a culturally informed thing that claims that it's, that tries to make it problematic for people to judge it who don't live there, it's kind of on its face ridiculous. And we also don't hold that standard to other people.
I would ask the person in the bomb shelter, would you prefer to be in a bomb shelter for 2 weeks or in a concentration camp for 15 years? Which would you choose if you had the option?
Right.
Well, I think, what time is it now?
It's 6:18. Yeah, I actually have to give my parents back their study. I'm in New York City with them, but yeah. But this has been amazing, and actually there are tons of more questions. So I will connect with you offline to figure out when we can hopefully do some more of these, and we can pre-tape or live or figure it out. But there's a lot more.
Okay. And I think we had a useful opportunity.
Yeah.
And I'll look forward to hearing from you again.
Great. And thank you so much. And people who didn't, whose questions weren't addressed, I will get to them with Professor Finkelstein, either in writing and video, either live or pre-taped. So again, thank you so much. And thanks everyone for coming to the stream. And I will see you Sunday night for a regularly scheduled show. And again, please subscribe. That's free. Just hit subscribe and then the bell. Make sure you go to Norman. Is it Norm or Norman? Finkelstein.com.
It's okay. My website is Norman Finkelstein. It's just my name is one word.
Yeah. Yeah. .com. Yeah. And again, thank you so much. And we will see you next time. And again, Norman Finkelstein, thank you so much. Buy all of his books. They're great. Follow him on Twitter, where he's just Norm Finkelstein, and go to his website, normanfinkelstein.com. Thanks, guys. See you Sunday. Bye. Oh, and go to the protest tomorrow in Brooklyn. Go to protest wherever you are. I'll put in my Twitter, and I'll pin tweet later today about where people can find the protest. Thanks for reminding me of that.
I would just want to say to your listeners, don't underestimate the power of your protests now. Israel is very concerned about its image, and each protest, each denunciation, they add up. And if you want to prevent Israel from becoming a parking lot, Gaza from being reduced to a parking lot, the protests mean something now. I have no doubt about that. Okay.
Okay. Thank you so much.
Bye-bye.
Bye. Bye, everyone. Thank you so much again.